A very good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Sushovan Sarkar, and I report on technology and cyber policy at the Quint News. We are fortunate today to be joined by retired Lieutenant General Saidata Hasnain, retired Lieutenant General Satish Dua, strategic affairs expert Abhinav Pandya, senior journalist Aditya Rajkol, and founder of Logically Lyric Gen to share their valuable insights on today's discussion titled The Visible Threat of Invisible Actors: How the Nature of National Security Threats in India is Evolving. When we think of national security threats to India, we invariably think of insurgency and terrorism, border disputes, protest and unrest within India, cyber warfare, and potentially even the security of India's technological future with the advent of 5G technology. A common theme here is the visible threat of invisible actors, whether within the country or from outside. But the nature of these threats is evolving, with social media, closed networks, and technology playing more influential roles today and requiring authorities to employ a wider variety of tools in their arsenal. We will be discussing the new threats India faces, how exactly it can leverage technology and technology-led intelligence services to defend itself, thereby converting unknown unknowns into known unknowns. Just before we begin, our event today has 3 sessions. We'll start with opening remarks from our panelists, followed by a moderated discussion, and then we'll go into the Q&A from members of the audience. But if you have questions at any point, please feel free to put in the questions in the Q&A section, and I'll try to sort of weave them in the discussion itself. So without further ado, we'll start with the opening remarks. Our first speaker today is retired Lieutenant General Said Atta Hasnain, a former commander of the Srinagar Base 15 Corps. He is currently the Chancellor of Central University of Kashmir and is also associated with Vivekananda Institutional Foundation and the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sushovan. It's a pleasure to be on board for this excellent idea of this webinar. And may I compliment all of you for having considered even looking at an aspect which very few people in India actually look at in terms of national security. I'm just back from the National Defense College. I was just speaking at the NDC a short while ago, and I was speaking on Kashmir. And while I was speaking, I just realized that your subject is a very interesting subject. It says visible threat of invisible actors. But through the 90s, Kashmir had something very different. It had an invisible threat from invisible actors. What do I mean by saying that? The ideology in Kashmir was attempted to be changed by Pakistan by bringing in an element of radical Islam, radical theology, philosophy, everything. None of us knew that is happening. None of these things were visible. The threat was not even perceptible to us at that time. It only came to us when it hit us at the end. And that's the kind of thing that we are looking at. When you don't have domain knowledge on this at all, that is the time when you start looking at these kind of things and thinking, my God, this is already upon us. And that's exactly what is happening to India. Let me give you a small historical perspective in my 4.5 minutes or 4 minutes or so, which I have with me. We are discussing this because the world is changing. That's the reason why it's happening. The aim of war is always to win, achieve an aim that you have laid out, political aim, military aim, territory, or whatever it is. But it's not necessary that you will use kinetics. It is not necessary that you will use the entire resources of the nation to try and achieve that victory. You will minimize. You will minimize, and you will probably follow the Sun Tzu principle of fighting or winning a war without fighting a war. And that has led to this current situation that we are in today. Started from the Cold War. The Cold War was a war, but not a war in which nations were at grips with each other. It led to the 80s, where the Afghan conflict actually gave the ideas of how a hybrid conflict can be ready. But that was the initial stages. Technology was still very far. Hybrid war came into being in the late 80s and really hit the world in Kashmir, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and places like that thereafter. And that was the time when technology started developing. We had a combination of elements of the conflict spectrum all coming together. You had flexibility to pick and choose the areas which you wanted to employ. core, you had the option, the flexibility to choose a particular core domain. For example, in Kashmir, it was terrorism initially. And while terrorism was going on, it was all about changing the mind. The mind, how? Through communication strategy, through influence warfare, through information warfare. None of these terminologies in that time were common in those days. Today, everyone is talking about it. Gulf War I is the time when this really came up. When CNN entered into the drawing rooms of the world, that brought the idea of how information can be used to win wars. That's something worth discussing at any stage. War under informationized conditions was adopted by China in 1993, within 3 years of the Gulf War, first Gulf War. And by 2003, China had already adopted the 3 strategies. That is the very famous media, cyber, and legal war. No one else in the world had thought about this or looked upon it. Everyone thought, people think today that these are the 3 strategies with which China will fight a war. That's not true. It's backed by a huge force, which is a deterrent by itself, right? They have all the technologies, everything in place, but they fight the war essentially with the bare essentials. That is these 3 aspects: legal, media, cyber. When you've just seen what's happened to Mumbai, you saw the trailer which China has played out with India in Mumbai with the outages that took place 2 months ago, as far as the power grid is concerned. I want to introduce in the 2 minutes I have, one interesting aspect here. Most of you may never have heard of this name of this man called Gene Sharp, Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp, 1993, is the man who wrote this very famous book called From Dictatorship to Democracy. And in that, he wrote a chapter called 198 Ways of Non-Violent Revolution. Why 198? I don't know. He could have taken it to 200 if it was required. But this became the Bible of the Arab Spring. This became the Bible of the color revolutions, which took place all over the Middle East, went into Ukraine, it went into Central Asia, into all areas. It had 3 comings. First, 1993 itself, then the Arab Spring. And now a third coming in 2017, 18, 19. When you saw different movements taking place around the world, from Bolivia to Hong Kong, all these movements have been taken. Now you see, suddenly you find a social environment which is changing, a technical environment which is changing, a security environment which is changing. When all these 3 things come to a head, it creates this kind of an issue of which we are looking at, the issue of invisible threats. Technology has enabled this in a huge way. The growing power of the internet, the penetration of the internet, the control of the mind, influence, warfare, all these are wars of today which will become huge things tomorrow. We don't know which direction it is going. So the war at the border is not necessary at the borders at all. All this is happening without entering into the borders of any nation. And all the nations can do is that they can actually deny it. All those who are perpetrating proxy war of this kind can remain in a situation of denial. How do you counter this? Last 30 seconds. How do you counter this? The simple phrase is an all-of-government approach. You cannot leave this to the police, the intelligence agencies, and the army to resolve. This is for the entire nation to look at, because the penetration is into the minds of the people. So everyone has to be involved in this. For an academic to say that I am not at war, sorry, you are very much at war. Unless you have the capability of research work through academics, etc., you cannot contain this war. You cannot fight this war. So the most important thing for the nation today to do is to look at this threat, examine it in totality. Look at the creation of a possible national body. Going down to the state level and possibly to the district level, exactly in the manner in which my organization, from where I'm speaking to you, is organized. The National Disaster Management Authority, which has got state disaster management authorities and district disaster management. You need an institutional approach to this, an organization which can be created, all the domains represented in that. If you think that only the army, the intelligence and the police is involved, sorry, this needs people from the technical streams, from the financial streams, academic, military, police, intelligence, political, everything. Only then can you counter this so-called threat, which is so invisible. Thank you very much. You are muted.
Right. Thank you very much, General Hasnan, for giving us the chronological context of how things sort of brought us to where we are today and what needs to be done moving forward from here. Our next speaker is retired Lieutenant General Satish Dua, a former Corps commander in Kashmir who retired as Chief of Integrated Defense Staff. He's a counterterrorism expert and also the author of India's Brave Hearts, Untold Stories from the Indian Army. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Shushovan. um, for me, it's a tough call to speak after General Hasnain because he's a respected senior colleague. He's also, as you just brought out in your introduction, has been a Corps commander of 15 Corps Srinagar, which I have the chair that I've occupied. So a lot of things that we would speak separately would resonate with each other. So I'll try and not repeat the things that he has repeated. So I beg your pardon, the things that he has already covered, but there is bound to be some overlap. Let me also start by saying that while in olden days, battles were fought in the battlefields, outside the cities where people don't get hurt. Then there was collateral damage in World War I, more in World War II because of air power and long-range artillery guns. So the civilians, the damage to civilians or loss to life and property was collateral damage. But today, it is the civilian who's being targeted. If there is an attack in the metro of London or the Twin Towers or a market in Delhi, it is the civilians who's targeted. Also, the mind space, as General Hasnain also mentioned, the mind space of citizenry is being targeted. So war is no longer a spectator sport for military to fight and civilians to cheer from the sidelines. Everyone is a target. And so is the notion of victory is also changed. But remaining with the topic of the threats that we are talking about, you see, it is also the fact, like I think General Hasnain also mentioned, that power shifts are now happening without battlefield victories. But the importance of military prowess will still remain undiminished. And asymmetric warfare leads the adversary. On one hand, there are these non-state actors, as also lawfare, a new thing that is being introduced, and I'll mention that. On the other hand, we also have economic aggression, debt entrapment. They are also tools of conflict, and that can carry serious consequences for small countries. Influence operations. I'm using different words. General Hasnain has also covered that. Against weaker states, lobbying, swaying of public discourse for both internal and external issues, whether it is the Ladakh standoff or the farmers' agitation. Okay, in the next 3.5 minutes left, I'll talk about 4 major issues. Psychological warfare. General Hasnain has mentioned that in great detail. I'll try not to repeat the things, but psychological warfare operations are, they are the broad concept of information warfare. Information warfare is a struggle to dominate the generation and flow of information so that we can enhance own strategic goals and degrade or constrain the opponent. This requires the ability to collect and manage and exploit accurate information. And we are talking of technology here. It is the nature of modern technology, informationized societies, operations are designed to influence a rival nation. And the interconnected nature of information as well as information systems makes clear-cut classification of military and civilian impossible. So, like he also mentioned, it was mentioned by General Hasnain, and I keep repeating that. I don't want to repeat that, but the fact is that today it is an ongoing process. It does not happen only in wartime. It is an ongoing process in what we call peacetime as well. So the next issue let me talk about is the cyber warfare. Military analysts are currently overwhelmed with the amount of data, whether it is generated by surveillance drones or monitoring of social media posts by terrorist groups. So cyber warfare is actually a sort of a contrast between algorithms as the AI systems look for network vulnerabilities to attack. Cyber warfare is not limited only to military applications. It targets critical information infrastructure, as well as the non-critical infrastructure. We can keep arguing whether lights went out in Mumbai was a cyber attack or not. But the prospect of trains being diverted from their routes, or banking services being interrupted, or boarding cards not being printed for few hours can throw panic. And all these three things, incidents that I mentioned, have actually happened. Lawfare. This is the new term. This is the new warfare. Lawfare is using the system of a country or organization to tie down the organs of government inextricably, imposing high costs. This is more applicable to pluralistic democracies. For example, taking recourse to legal action in human rights cases based on correct or of mostly false information. Hybrid warfare. The term hybrid warfare describes a strategy that employs conventional military force supported by regular and cyber warfare tactics. So it's on the cusp of the conventional and sub-conventional wars fought by regular and irregular capability. There is a gray zone which can be exploited by a nation which is little lower in its capability or a little weaker. The clearest strategy of this gray zone were in the recent past the Russian intervention in Ukraine. We see China's behavior in South China Sea, Iran's use of proxy militias to establish their arc of influence in the Middle East. So all these countries, they actually to some extent recognize and to some extent fear this superior Western military power, but all of them see vulnerabilities that they can exploit. So having said this, there can be many more. In fact, I would like to, before ending my intervention, I'd like to talk, invisible threats of visible actors. In fact, if we have to expand the discussion, if we have time, I would like to introduce the F word here. And instead of visible actors, actually, we could expand it to visible factors, because there are so many other aspects beyond this technical realm that we have discussed. And I suppose as we go on during our discussion, we can talk about how these threats have to be recognized as warfare, and then how we can go ahead with ways of creating better responses to these and many more such factors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Dua, for laying it out for us that what we are facing today is an ongoing process, and touching upon the four issues of information, psychological, cyber, and lawfare. Moving forward, we have a third speaker, Abhinav Pandya, former Strategic Affairs Advisor in the Office of the Governor of Jammu and Kashmir. He is also the founder and CEO of Usana's Foundation, a geopolitical and security affairs organization based in India. Over to you, Abhinav.
Thank you very much, Sushovan. Thank you. In fact, I am absolutely honored to be here with such an esteemed panel. Atta sir has always been a mentor. We have learned Kashmir from him. And my good afternoon to all of you. So I was asked to address two questions. First of all, how can we use cyber tools to counter the misinformation and disinformation campaigns without going for like complete internet shutdowns? And secondly, how can we use cyber tools to counter the terror communications and the terror financing related communications? I'll begin with my first question. Though I'm not much of an expert on technical issues, but I have made some notes and done some homework, which I would like to share with you. I think that, I can begin with the idea that it's not completely possible to completely stop it, but yes, certainly we can make it difficult for them. So some technical areas where we can intervene are the following, like we can start giving static IP addresses to the telephone numbers. So like when you use internet from your laptop or from your desktop, you have a permanent IP address. But when you use it from your phone, your IP addresses keep changing every 1 hour or like every half an hour. And ultimately you'll have about 50 to 60 IP addresses if you keep the track of the messages which are coming. So in that case, we can give a static IP addresses to phone numbers. In that case, if we have a static IP address, then any message which is hateful, which is problematic, if it's originating from some telephone number, we can track it through that static IP address. But that may be a little costly. But yes, I mean, in the interest of national security, we can, compel, or we can make it mandatory for the internet service providers or the telecom companies to come out with such a facility. Secondly, we can also have this spammer technology. So especially when we are using apps, maybe WhatsApp or YouTube or Facebook, we can have an inbuilt program where you can the syntax can be like that. If a particular set of words, for instance, something about communal violence, okay, maybe like, hate Islam, or maybe like hate Hinduism. If we can decide a particular set of words which can be possibly used to influence an election or maybe incite a communal riot, those set of words can always be fit in there. And if any post comes out with those kinds of words, certainly that spammer technology can filter and stop, and like it can put a barrier to at least 80 to 90% of that stuff. That we can do. Besides that, I mean, if we have Twitter accounts or social media accounts in our country, normally when we register for them, we have to give our email IDs. Sometimes it's optional for us to give the phone numbers also. So when you're registering through the email IDs, there is a strong possibility of creating fake email IDs and logging in. So what we can do is that we can make it mandatory to use a registered mobile number or a phone number to create a social media account. In that case also, we can track such messages. Besides that, I think the companies which are providing such services, maybe Facebook, WhatsApp, they have immense capabilities to track such hateful messages, because they have an inbuilt system. So legally, it should be mandatory for them to have a robust mechanism to track such information flows. I think lately Facebook has developed something, it's AI-based system, like analyzing terabytes of information per day. So in case if some group is working based in Russia or in some European country, then they do get a sense that from where it is coming. And once, we should have a legal mechanism to at least compel them to tell us that what's happening, where it is coming from. And then we can use the traditional tools of diplomacy and statecraft, just reaching out to their governments, to their, high commissions, embassies, and just say, please do that. It can be done in a very back channel manner, but it is one technique which has to be done. And then like I feel that, it's not just about the crisis time that we have to prepare for. We also need to be well prepared during the peace times. Our intelligence agencies need to develop a very robust counter mechanism. Like you should have a skilled team of social media experts who should be tracking, the social media accounts like day in and day out. And the moment you spot any kind of information like which has the potential to create problems, if it is spotted, at that very moment it has to be nipped in the bud. You have to get in touch with the company or the service providers and just stop it right there. And then we already know that there are some groups which are there to sabotage your national interests. For instance, you have PFI, you have Khalistan organization. We already know about them. And like in the routine peacetime, we can always keep a track of their coordinators, their operatives based in India. So I mean, if we keep monitoring their activities and keep a track of what they are doing, okay, certainly we'll have at least some people like whom we can zero in on or focus on when we have such disturbances. Interrogating them can always fetch you much better information. Finally, I mean, when you have these apps coming from foreign countries, or the possibility of foreign intelligence agencies having the penetration in these companies cannot be completely ruled out. So it's always better to have your own systems. We can have our own platforms, the indigenous platforms, social media platforms where people can register. And then lastly, I would say, as it is not just something which can be confined to military or police domains or intelligence domains, I would really like to thank Ata Hussain sir that he brought in the subject matter of academics. It's academicians and the academic world has a great responsibility to set a larger narrative, and that too as a preemptive gesture, or like in the peace times, covering all these issues, so that we have a very overarching, strong, robust wall, which can always work as a very strong, protective shield against such, targeted attacks when they happen. I guess I've already crossed my time limit. Is it so, or Sushovan?
Yeah, I think so. I think
Okay, fine. Yeah, I can talk later in the question and answer session. Thank you. Sorry
right,
for the.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sort of like opening the discussion also into a more technological aspect of policy and the kind of policy interventions that you envisage along with diplomatic channels. So we can sort of expand into that as we move into the moderated discussion. Our next speaker for his opening remarks is Aditya Rajkol, a senior journalist and contributing editor to CNN News 18, who covers national security, diplomacy, and conflict. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Sushoban. And what a great honor this is to, in fact, share stage with very important commentators on national security, particularly General Hussain and General Dua. And in fact, they've mentioned in greater detail a topic. And I think there's not much to add from my side. I'll just perhaps give my own experiences in some of the conflict areas and my observations in the next 5 minutes. General Hussain and General Dua have, in fact, elaborated on what hybrid warfare actually is, what India has been facing in the recent times. There are several examples to quote from, and also psychological warfare and the cyber warfare, which we'll see much more in the coming months and years. To begin with, I think to understand these kinds of warfares, the changing technology and the changing threats, and a very important topic that we are discussing, visible threats of invisible actors, we'll have to study also over the last many decades what these visible and invisible threats have been, and particularly in the last few years. Already, a very important example that General Hussain gave was of Gene Sharp's book to study that nonviolence pattern, what we saw all through the Arab Spring, and what we can witness in Jammu and Kashmir. And has the government or the national security apparatus really gone into it and perhaps recreate it in a way of a tricolor revolution in Jammu and Kashmir? General Hussain and I were together not very long ago at the Army War College, where he elaborated in greater detail what this revolution really is, what the pattern is all about, the non-violent movement, and how to tackle it. And are we failing at it? Are we really recognizing the root cause of the problem? That is very important and essential that we need to study in greater detail. Again, in the recent times, the diplomatic changes, India's power push globally, and the national security paradigm shift in the recent times, and several lessons that India has learned as well in due course, need to be analyzed. I again say both visible as well as invisible threats. For example, starting with the Uri terror attack, thereafter we saw, of course, the surgical strike happening. We saw the Pathankot terror attack, the Dina Nagar attack, and of course, thereafter, most recently, the Pulwama terror attack, which was responded by Balakot. So we need to look at both internal as well as the external dimensions. And I will briefly touch upon the controversial aspects as well here, which is, of course, of the political confrontations on national security aspects domestically, which cause a concern. We saw after the Balakot strike, of course, India's messaging and India's communication was under question as to the narrative that was completely changed within a few hours by Pakistan. And India certainly couldn't counter that. And the entire Balakot strike shifted towards a very different aspect of Pakistan capturing our own wing commander Abhinandan, and thereafter we know what happened. Gradually, India took a very bold step in the form of abrogation of Article 370, and again came under question the messaging skills of India, even though the policy was great at a security, political, and diplomatic level. But on the security front, on the messaging front, I beg your pardon, there were questions raised. For example, since we are, openly discussing this at a public platform, I can give realistic examples as well. There was a protest that happened in particular area of Srinagar, and Government of India denied it, that there was any kind of such violent protest, and thereafter had to recognize a week later that it did happen. So, and immediately we saw Western media pouncing on India. Of course, much of it was crafted. There were Chinese state elements as well. There was Pakistani propaganda channels, etc., at work. But India's communication and messaging again was under question. So these threats are very important and significant as well. I say this in the context of the most recent example of the toolkit controversy as well. And again, I'm not going into the right or wrong of the farmer laws here. We are not discussing the farmer laws. We are not discussing what the political approach of BJP, Congress, or XYZ party is. Politics is very separate from this. But there was a toolkit that was put out in open, and there were links of Bhajan Singh Binder and Peter Frederick that were noted very prominently. And without going into detail, many of the people questioned the security forces and the investigative agencies as to this being really, just a second, this being a very controversial subject, and human rights activists have been questioned by the Indian government, and action has been taken very, without going into the realistic details. But the reality remains, if somebody studies the pattern of how this particular person, Bhajan Singh Bindare, appointed by a ISI recruit, Iqbal Chaudhry, how this really happened, not just in the recent times, but for over a decade, you will understand the information campaign, the kind of communication strategy that they have, had, the psychological warfare that is, opening. And Indian media almost created Peter Frederick as a hero, a human rights activist, without realizing that he was recruited actually by Bhajan Singh Bindare years ago. And there's no, roots or, details of even Bhajan Singh Bindare. He claims to be a Sikh from Malaysia, but, there are no details whatsoever of his, ancestors, etc. So, we need to understand that there are larger forces at work beyond our control, and India needs to be prepared for such kind of activities as well. This was witnessed just about a year ago during the CAA protests as well. Again, I'm not saying that CAA is right or wrong, or should have happened or shouldn't have happened, but the kind of misinformation campaigns that happened during that time, almost leading the particular community in India to believe that this was a law completely against them. And, it shaped in a form of a mass movement, several protests all across India. But the root, cause, or the root thing was about the CAA, the definition of the CAA. And the Indian government somehow could not convince the people what it really meant. And now with the farm laws, again, we have significant protests happening, roads blocked for more than 3 months now. And again, there are external factors at play. There are external factors who are utilizing this opportunity to create divisions within the systems. And we need to also realize espionage has taken a very different turn. And espionage or spying that happens from foreign nations, particularly, or foreign powers, is a significant challenge and a threat as well, because it's not just human intelligence that they are really looking at this stage. They are going into detail of, tracking your systems very closely, hacking the system very importantly, hiring not just, experts, but even journalists for that matter, in foreign nations to extract and track information. I'll give you a brief example of the Galwan Valley episode and the standoff that happened last year. And immediately after that, I started receiving calls from a UK-based journalist asking me about information about WhatsApp calls, I beg your pardon, and asking me information about the troop movement, about at Galwan, how the Mountain Strike Corps was forming in that particular area, what India's response really was. And after a few phone calls, of course, I was not revealing any details, but after a few phone calls, I got a little suspicious. And I approached my friends in the National Security Council to track that number and see what really was happening. And it was subsequently, told to me that it was a ISI person calling from Lahore and posing as a UK journalist and trying to extract information. And subsequently, it was realized that several senior army officers also received similar phone call, not as a UK journalist, but playing as their superior officer in the Indian Army. So, this is just a small example I'm giving. There's much more aggressive techniques that are being used by, several foreign powers, foreign players to extract information, etc. So I think it's important to form your strategy, realizing the modern techniques that are being used by foreign powers. In the most recent example, just a few months ago, we saw how I think Indian Express did that story about Zenova Technologies from China, actually exposing how they were tracking big data, they were tracking Prime Minister, senior army officers, National Security Council, and whoever was important in India, actually studying their behavioral patterns, studying their online activity, and very, very carefully observing each and every movement to manipulate this data perhaps, or to use to their advantage. So I think we need to recognize this in greater detail. And I lastly, before I end my initial interjection, one of the biggest worries is also radicalization. And radicalization in many ways is also not visible, in my opinion. We saw that we have been witnessing this in Kashmir for a very long time, as General Hasnain talked about it very briefly. We saw the Colombo bombings and how its roots somehow were in India as well. The terror group was in touch with some of the actors in Kerala. And in just a few years ago, I think it was 2015 or 16, suddenly over 2 dozen very educated, very intelligent people were recruited by the ISIS, and they left India and joined the ISIS in Afghanistan and Syria. So I think this is a greater challenge that we have not been able to recognize or work against. We, of course, on policy papers, on think tank seminars, we speak about de-radicalization. We speak about how this is a major potential challenge, but at grassroots level, not much is being done. I'll give you a brief example of my visit in Pulwama, which I've spoken about repeatedly in the past as well, of how in several mosques, after Friday prayers, there is a lot of brainwashing that unfortunately happens, misinformation that is given to youth. And I've seen this with my own eyes. I've heard this with my own ears, particularly in the belts of Kakapura, and neighboring villages where Jaish-e-Mohammed has been very active. There's a lot of brainwashing happening, and the government hasn't been able to do anything about it. So I think the government needs to do much more on the front of radicalization as well, and the washing, the recruitment that happens, because in Kashmir, of course, terrorism has declined a bit as compared to statistics of the past. We've also seen a decline of terror attacks and infiltration, but I think radicalization is at its peak, just like it was in 1990s, and this is a risk, a threat that is not visible right now, but perhaps in future we will realize this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aditya, for sort of opening the discussion on the issues of espionage. How recent socio-political events in the country have also been shaped by external elements, and on radicalization. Our fifth panelist today is Lyric Jain, the founder and CEO of Lyrically, an organization that works in tackling misinformation and improving civic discourse through human and artificial intelligence.
Thanks, Satish. Hi. Yes, I'm the founder and CEO of Lyrically. It's a pleasure to be on such an esteemed panel. What we do is we identify misinformation and disinformation online and around the world at scale using technology. And certainly, we and I personally haven't been doing this as long as the other panelists on this webinar at the moment. So what I'll try and contextualize some of my comments with is what we've been seeing in the field, particularly over the last couple of years, and in particular how we've seen the space evolve just in the last 3 or 4 years that we've been involved. I think the logical point to start here would be to identify which actors, at least state actors, participate in influence operations and conduct influence operations outside their own borders. When we started back in 2016-17, there was just over a dozen countries that really had any significant capabilities in that area. Today, it's over 80. So just that should be a big signal in terms of how seriously we should be taking this new threat vector, both because of the level of investment that's being put in by various adversarial actors, particularly our noisy neighbors, around influence operations. And these influence operations aren't just designed to influence certain populations. They're often targeted in a way to try and achieve a very specific operational goal. That's the whole point of an influence operation, to achieve some kind of real world impact. That impact might be to sow discord in a certain community. It might be to try and shift government policy by leveraging the right audience, the right electorate, and the right influences. Or it might just be kind of planting stories in front of journalists just so that they get so excited by some things, by how potentially ground-shattering certain findings could be, to the tune that any influence operation that actor might have conducted would be limited to kind of 100,000 people, 1 million people. It wouldn't reach that many people. But when certain levers and certain friendly actors and what the Russians term in influence operations useful idiots, for lack of a better word, are used to amplify messages that otherwise wouldn't be delivered to large audiences of millions of people. That's when these become particularly problematic. That's the type of narrative amplification that we're seeing more often being targeted, particularly in India. One of the other areas that often isn't talked about is the non-state actors that are involved. I'll perhaps start with an American example here. Who would have thought a conspiracy group, QAnon, responsible for potentially for breaking into potentially the most secure building in the world, a conspiracy theorist community? That's literally all they were. They were, of course, involved in some fairly serious threat events previously, but nothing quite close to that level. We're quite used to, in radicalization context, talking about Islamist extremism and other forms of extremism, but this is really a very new threat vector, especially in a society that's as polarized as ours at the moment. Finding ways in which you can kind of drop a digital trail of breadcrumbs to try and radicalize people and push people down that rabbit hole even further, that's a mechanism that's very powerful, and it acts as a recruitment channel for a lot of these radicalized groups. And in the work that we do across cities, states, and across the country, what we find is that the recruitment, despite best intentions from various organizations to intervene, isn't being reduced. The rate of recruitment is only increasing, particularly in some of our border states. So it's something that needs urgent attention. And a couple of the points that were made earlier were around kind of what countermeasures would really be appropriate here. There was a couple of examples of countermeasures that might have been kind of stepping the line a bit. So what we really need to work on is not just the identification of these threats, but building our understanding of what appropriate, proportionate, and effective countermeasures look like. Sometimes it's just not enough taking down these accounts. Sometimes it's not enough stopping the message getting to certain people. By doing that, in some cases, you turn these people into digital martyrs, and they go off to other platforms. They move away from Facebook, Twitter, and all of these platforms, and dive into Telegram, Signal, and WhatsApp, where kind of enforcement is a lot more challenging. So it's unclear at present what is most effective, and I think that's one of the areas where most work needs to be done. On the detection side of things, there is a silver lining to discuss. And that's the fact that, again, using the American context here, what happened at Capitol Hill at the start of January could have been prevented very easily. Everyone had signals. Everyone was seeing a very different piece of the puzzle. We had some signals kind of 36 hours before it happened. Facebook have publicly declared they had some signals before the fact. And certainly the national security apparatus of the United States had some signals. But everyone was seeing a very different operating picture. No one saw the complete picture. And of course, as is chronic around the world, there was a breakdown in coordination between security agencies at federal level, at national level in the US, with those that were acting within DC. And that, I think, ties into the point that General Hussain was making, which is that we really need an institutional response that is coordinated, that doesn't just operate at the national level, but operates at the national level across states, across cities, and is multidisciplinary in nature. It brings into place people from law enforcement, military, intelligence, private sector technologies, academics, philosophers, strategic communicators, marketers, everyone, to try and find a way in which we can both identify these threats as swiftly as we can and then respond to them. One final thing to perhaps leave you with on the introductory side of our panel today is looking at how disinformation is affecting national security, but not typical aspects of national security as one might expect. Things like the COVID vaccine. The narratives that we're seeing emerge from China that try to deflect blame and try and deflect for what the source of the virus might be, attributing it to American soldiers that went to Wuhan, etc. those got a whole lot of coverage within India, and it got to the point where a significant percentage of the Indian population believes that it was in fact that the virus was actually started in the US and not in China, and where patient zero, a lot of Indians believe apparently was American soldiers and not Wuhan. So this kind of goes to show even something as mainstream, even something as that's changed our reality as much as COVID. There's large sections of our population that still believe something, and the reason they believe it is because it's an explicit influence operation and propaganda campaign that was conducted by the CCP. So it's chilling to think that if that's the impact that these actors can have on something as substantive as that, and at such a large population, what could they do when it comes to really challenging fringe issues where the information environment is uncertain, where as some of the panelists earlier were mentioning, how do you know a riot has appeared somewhere? How do we know when certain things are happening in conflict areas? And dealing with misinformation, both that naturally exists because of kind of public curiosity and the way human psychology works, but also the overt disinformation that comes from across our borders presents a real and present danger. But again, I'll point to the silver lining, which is we can detect this stuff. We can detect this behavior. It is doable, but it needs a lot of people to come together across the public sector, across the private sector, to have a somewhat transparent framework through which all of these threats are identified. Some of them are prioritized, and we then respond to these threats in a way that's proportionate and effective, and not just ad hoc by trying to take everything down.
Thank you very much, Lyric. And I think the issue of misinformation itself and misinformation campaigns opens up many more questions in this particularly difficult area, especially in the context of national security. So now that we're done with the opening remarks, I think we've set the ground for a number of related questions to start off with quickly. And our audience members have also started sending in questions. So I'll try to weave in a couple of those questions in this moderated discussion before we actually open up the floor for the audience Q&A. So going first to General Hasnain. So you've spoken about us requiring an institutional approach to dealing with the visible threats of invisible actors, and you've spoken about the adversaries being backed by legal, media, and cyber forces. So my question to you would be in the context of hybrid warfare and the ways in which it is playing out in current times, and especially in the context of the reports of the power outage in Mumbai last year, which has now been attributed to alleged threat actors in China. So how do you assess the roles of such invisible actors, given what we are seeing currently, and how can an institutional approach sort of help us counter this?
Can I be heard? Can you hear me, Sushovan? Okay,
Yes.
Great. I think the best way to explain this to you is in the context of the current job which I'm doing. I am a member of the National Disaster Management Authority. And this act was in 2005, the Disaster Management Act was enacted. It stated very clearly that different disasters, earthquake, for example, cyclone, for example, will be handled by different ministries, right? Or you have different ministries across the board. So someone is handling cyclone, someone is handling locust, someone is handling drought, floods, and now the glacial outburst which has happened in Uttarakhand. There are different ministries, but there is one authority, the National Disaster Management Authority. One authority. We are the ones sitting here who are the domain people. We are looking at the experts. They are the domain experts of their areas, but we are looking at the concept, we are looking at doctrine. We are studying, keeping in touch with different scientific advisors. We are keeping in touch with the academic world, all kinds of practitioners. They keep coming in and out. We conduct We've got the National Disaster Response Force under us. We've got the National Institute of Disaster Management under us. Now, from this, you will understand this. You see, hybrid war is a war of mixture of threats, all kinds of things. The domain of cyber is someone else's responsibility. The domain of psychological warfare is someone else's responsibility. The domain of radicalism is someone else's responsibility. Ministry of Minority Affairs, for example, or something like that. How do you bring this entire thing together? Everyone can't start fighting these in their own domain. You just can't do it. This is exactly what Rick was telling us, that you need an institutional approach. Now, if you have got a UPSC, Union Public Service Commission, to look at the entire aspect of entry into the civil cadres of the government of India, administrative cadres of the government of India, if you've got a national authority for planning, for example, the Niti Aayog, why can't you got the NDMA here, based upon what we perceived as huge threats from the Gujarat earthquake to the tsunami to the cyclone in Odisha, which had 10,000 casualties. All this evolved into the National Disaster Management Authority in December 2005. So now, if we are realizing that there are so many threats in the hybrid domain, and it's a long time that we've been at it, it's about time that we looked at creating an organization which can have an all-of-government approach. It can have multi-domain approach. And similarly, build this down right to the level, lower levels, in cities, in districts, and states, and everywhere. And it needs people from multi-disciplines, all kinds of disciplines. And I'll kill this question, but there's a very interesting question in your chat box, which talks about what is the role of academics? It's come from Berlin. There's a gentleman from Berlin who's asking, what is the role of academics in this entire thing? I say academics are the most important people in this. Because, when I experimented with counter hybrid war and counter influence war in 15 Corps in Kashmir, I always quote this example. In 3 days, I ran out of ideas. I thought I could sustain this for years. In 3 days, I ran out of ideas. You need the only people who can research and give you ideas, ideate with you, are the academics. That is their actual. Thank you.
General Dua, I would also like to sort of extend this question to you, and you've also touched upon some of the points that General Hasnain brought up. So specifically, the utilization of cyberspace for military operations holds the potential to infuse a certain jointness, quote unquote, among the Army, Navy, and Air Force. And we have now seen the Defense Cyber Agency as a tri-service agency in this regard. And based on what experts have said, is that there is a need for a framework which brings in a sort of seamless integration between the three forces. But the concern appears to be, and General Huda had also sort of mentioned it in an interview not very long ago, is that the task is to work around the vertical stovepipes or silos into which the three services have enclosed themselves. Do you see this as an issue in a situation where a unique dimension of warfare, which is the cyber dimension, requires this kind of integration to take place, and whether that is an area that should be worked on?
We've just discussed over the last half an hour or more. So this is a continuous kind of warfare. It does not differentiate between military and civil targets. It has very different notions of victory. It is not territorial gains or economic subjugation only. It seeks to influence minds towards an intended decision making, to try and put it simply. So it is a continuous threat. It is a warfare. And I think it is the duty of armed forces to protect the country and citizenry against any kind of threat. But how does it do that? It is not a military task alone. And you mentioned a few structures. Whether you take United States or China, the cyber commands or their equivalents are the most important organizations there dealing with this. We have started the process just a couple of years ago. And the General Huda statement that you mentioned, when we say that we've started the process a couple of years ago in our country, General Huda speaks about the stovepipes. So he's talking of silos that Army, Navy, Air Force and other fields in which academicians, technocrats, software guy, everyone comes in. You know, the one of the most important organs that or constituent to fight this is going to be when General Hasnan talks of academicians. I would also like to include in that academics, let's say the fresh graduates who are doing IITs or who are good at what they do. We need all of their might to be integrated into this. So coming back to the point, we have now started raising a cyber command, a space command. Albeit starting small, we have said it initially be called an agency. But this is where not only Army, Navy, and Air Force need to be organized. And let me just, in 2 minutes or less than that, lay out the organization that our country has already put out for everyone's information. It has been divided into three parts: critical infrastructure, non-critical information infrastructure, and the military or the defense information infrastructure. The critical information infrastructure, we can understand whether it is the power grids, the nuclear command structures, all the very important critical information infrastructure is with the NTRO. All the intelligence agencies and all other agencies that plug in are led by NTRO. The non-critical information infrastructure is with the ministry, the METI, and the defense is with this cyber command, where all three are being integrated. The last sentence I'd like to put across to you. Let me say that we are not as disintegrated, to use the wrong, I mean, as you may feel, or that statement of General Huda, which is a little out of context here, because it is required that we dovetail our efforts together, but we are really not disintegrated, or we are really not disjointed, I should say. I, as chief of IDS, I was heading the nucleus of what is today's cyber command. The nucleus is called DIARA, Defense Investigation and Reassurance Agency. There we were actually integrating the efforts of all three, and there are no boundaries between civil and military. Similarly, there are no boundaries between Air Force, military, and the cyber worlds. So all of them actually do coordinate a lot. Yes, we need to integrate much more. We need to integrate several more than just beyond Army, Navy, and Air Force. And that's the point I'm making. I'd like to leave with that thought that we must remember it's a threat. And armed forces have a warfare mentality. And I don't say we can do anything by ourselves, but perhaps can take a lead role in formalizing the responses.
Right. And some of the questions that have been coming in have also to do with some of the points that Mr. Pandya touched upon, especially in the context of Jammu and Kashmir. These questions have been coming in about traceability, about registering oneself on social media, about keyword. So some of these measures we've already seen being notified by the government in the recent rules to the the IT rules under the IT Act. So how do you see these IT rules that have come in, which have also mandated traceability of the first originator of a message, which would have potential implications for end-to-end encryption, for example? So there are concerns regarding that as well. So how do you see these measures that we see in the public domain now regarding social media, regarding OTT platforms? How do you see those playing out in serving the purpose of countering or being able to keep a closer watch on state and non-state actors infiltrating or trying to infiltrate messaging apps and social media?
Thank you, Sushovan, for putting across this question. Well, I feel that these measures, especially to trace the origins of the messages on the encrypted acts, I mean, I would certainly agree that, in the interest of national security, you do need very robust and strong measures. Obviously, there is always a debate about the privacy, freedom of expression. But those things aside, I mean, we are living in a very different country, and we have different set of circumstances. We have different kind of neighbors. Probably I would prefer to call them rogue states. So we need different kinds of rules. So keeping those things in consideration, certainly we need rules like that, and these are welcome rules. But then I would say that this communication challenge, I mean, it is by nature, it is so tricky that you cannot offset it completely. Suppose instance, like, for example, okay, you like recently I was in Kashmir for some of my research work, and I saw like how brilliantly with some of the finest technological work the militants were bypassing the communication ban, this internet lockdown. They were using the onion router based technology, customized apps which work in the dark net, and I mean you don't have access to them sometimes, and actually there is nothing called, I mean you can't hack the entire app. If the app has excellent like protective shields and some kind of privacy features, okay, for instance maybe WhatsApp or Telegram, unless the app providers don't give you the data, and if they have servers lying in some enemy country, for instance Turkey has come up with a new app called BIP, which is like a large number of people have shifted to that Turkish app BIP in Jammu and Kashmir. So their servers are in that country. Okay, there is no possibility of getting access to that. I mean those messages, because Turkey is the main villain in Kashmir. Of late, like lately, it has come up as the biggest, I would say, vileful nation, spreading all kinds of misinformation, radicalizing people through different narratives, dealing with the militants, dealing with the separatists. Okay? So I mean, it is not possible to completely break this challenge, but then you always improvise, you innovate. Okay, and I mean, it's a continuous battle, I would say. And then once again, yes, bringing back the role of academics, like what Atta Hasnan sir said, and General Dua also mentioned, I mean, we need to set a larger narrative. For example, like, if there's, suppose Turkey is talking about human rights violation in Kashmir, okay, tell me, do we have a strong research paper on the human rights violations by terrorist groups in Indian Kashmir? Leave aside Pak occupied Kashmir or Gilgit Baltistan. Okay, I mean, our universities, I went to places like St. Stephen's College in Delhi, and I knew, I mean, we were taught completely different things. Okay, we never looked beyond what happens in Delhi or what happens in JNU. But those guys are constantly creating narratives. It is the duty of the academicians to work on such research projects. For example, Turkey has like this Ertugrul, there's a serial which has become immensely famous in Jammu and Kashmir, okay, and it has played a major role in radicalizing. Today, if you go and talk to average Kashmiri, he wants to go and visit the grave of Caliph Osman. They are wearing those, Ertugrul style caps and all. Why? Because we don't provide the alternate narrative. If we had come out with some good research papers on how militants have violated human rights, they have killed females, they have killed female SPOs, they have raped women, they have tortured children. Those people who are forced to give shelter to the militants, that always happens on the gunpoint. What Jamaat Islami has done. And then I would say that, whatever radicalization happens through social media apps, or even when militants communicate through these encrypted applications, there is always a much, much stronger and a larger infrastructure working on the ground. That's what you call the subtext of jihad, or the subtext of coordinators or their OGWs. And that comes in the form of organizations like Jamaat Islami or maybe PFI in Kerala. So you have to go and just catch them. It's not all that much invisible as we make it out to be. It is pretty much visible. We just have to trace them, find out, and regularly be after them. It can go just on and on. Sorry.
Right. It's interesting that you also touched upon the Turkish Ertugrul, and I sort of, to broaden the horizon of this discussion, I would also like to sort of go to Aditya Rajkol to sort of understand his view on the internet shutdown aspect in Jammu and Kashmir, because you've reported from there, and as a blunt instrument of cutting off access to disinformation, misinformation campaigns, rumors, etc. How did you, as a journalist, one of the primary responsibilities is to get a communication across. So a lot of what we're discussing today also depends on the pipelines provided by internet to sort of reach a large mass of people. So how did you see this move to sort of cut off the internet, high-speed internet, for about 18 months from a media and communication perspective? Or do you sort of subscribe to the research which says that cutting off the internet can in fact exacerbate the spread of rumors and panic, because there is no way to verify what is factually correct? And Abhinav can also sort of come in later, since he's also worked in Kashmir. But to Aditya, how do you see this?
Well, Sushovan, you put me in a catch-22, because I'm somewhere in the middle. Because
Right.
to be very honest, it's unfair. internet is almost like a fundamental right, unsaid fundamental right now, and it's very difficult. I have friends in Kashmir. I've reported from Kashmir during the shutdown, and it's difficult. It's difficult not just for professionals, not just for students, but even for the government themselves to function at a time when there's a complete high-speed internet blockade. Although I agree that the broadband was restored in some time, but the 4G has been restored very recently. It's been almost 18 months. Uh, I'll go a little further back and I'll initially talk about the political intent. You know, the political intent to question and tackle the misinformation, particularly if we speak in the context of Kashmir, is very important. And over the years, what we've seen in the larger context, in a broader horizon in Kashmir, is that separatism and misinformation utilized by separatists, etc., was being incentivized. And this incentivization policy has only faced a setback post 2017. We saw NIA registering a case of terror conspiracy and terror funding, and gradually broadening their investigation not just about the Uri trade route, but also studying the dark web. They studied WhatsApp, they studied Telegram, they studied other apps and the dark web to understand how terror groups in Kashmir were in touch with their handlers in Pakistan. How through WhatsApp groups, many of those WhatsApp groups I also tried to intrude into and understand how directions were actually coming in from Pakistan. And those more than 300 WhatsApp groups were in fact made dysfunctional. But there are other apps, as Abhinav pointed out, that are being used even now. So, to be analytical, to be fair, yes, the internet shutdown has helped reduce violence drastically. Yes, the internet shutdown has reduced, terror attacks significantly. The money channel between Pakistan and India, the Hawala links and the communication has disturbed the not just the separatists, not just the stone pelters, but the radical elements who are recruiting many more people. So yes, but this isn't the solution. This cannot be a larger solution in the long run. So I think our cyber experts, our National Security Council, particularly the NTRO, needs to be much more equipped, which it is. Drastically, things have changed in the last 2 to 3 years, particularly after the abrogation of 370. NTRO played a very significant role in Kashmir in detecting how things are unfolding on ground, but a lot more needs to be achieved and done. So I personally believe that misinformation is a bigger challenge in the context of Kashmir, not just about violence and terrorism. Even through the pandemic, we saw massive amounts of misinformation being spread in Kashmir, which was a challenge not just for the forces and the government, but for the doctors and the medical practitioners as well. So I think there needs to be a political intent, which has been there, but now in the long run, you cannot have internet shutdown as a solution to this kind of a problem. Thank you.
Right, right. And, I would like Lyric Jain to sort of come in at this point and sort of expand a little bit on what he had touched upon. And he touched upon a very interesting aspect of, non-state actors in spreading conspiracy theories like QAnon.
Just, Sushman, one last point. I'm sorry to
Right.
cut you short since you mentioned Lyric. And I wanted to bring in this, since Lyric is here, if he could also talk about his new technology, the intelligence-based threat analysis technology, which is certainly going to play a very key role. And I've been reading about it. I think this will be a significant game changer in Kashmir also. That's my limited point. Thank you.
Right, right. So, I mean, if Lyric could just sort of expand on the role that AI can play in identifying these large networks of coordinated misinformation campaigns and some of the possible approaches in sort of countering this effectively. Lyric, can you hear me?
Lyric,
Yeah, Lyric, can you hear us?
can you hear us? No, I think it's no. It seems somehow his thing is frozen. No. Maybe we can move on. When he comes back, he can probably answer.
Right. So I would just sort of uh, sort of open up some of the questions, and a number of questions have been uh, coming in. One of the questions that I would sort of like to start off with is uh, about some of the major social media platforms in Kashmir used by terrorist organizations for radicalization. And uh, Abhin- Abhinav or Aditya could sort of jump in on this. Since we spoke about the issue of radicalization through social media channels. Um, are there specific trends that have been noticed in this regard? You're muted, Abhinav.
Aditya, you would like to go first, then I can jump in.
Yeah, sure. I think radicalization. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to study this in greater detail since I cover all the agencies, the security apparatus, and the intelligence agencies down on ground. More focus has been in the recent times to kill terrorists and not terrorism, to eradicate radicalists and not radicalism in Kashmir. So I think we need to broaden our picture and have deadlines in place that how terrorism can be eradicated, how radicalism can be eradicated in Kashmir. So there needs to be a not just a policy audit of our failures and mistakes in the past decades that can reflect on changes that need to be made on ground, but also study case by case particular areas, as Abhinav mentioned, Jamaat Islami, JKLF, and several others key factors. Even frontline political parties, I'm no shame in admitting, like PTP, who have been playing a significant role in radicalization in South Kashmir. I mean, where else would you find stone pelters, in fact, being recruited as relationship managers of Jammu and Kashmir Bank? So I think it's quite funny how mainstreaming of radicalization has happened. I was recently having a chat with the Lieutenant Governor Manoj Sinha as well, and it's amazing how it only is in a span of 6 months he has realized how radicalism has also been ingrained into the bureaucratic levels in Jammu and Kashmir, how recruitments have happened of radicals without any basic, a greater high level education into mid level and junior level positions in J&K police, in several departments of the J&K government as well. And my information suggests that perhaps in the next 6 months, there will be action taken against them. Again, this action isn't limited and certainly isn't a larger long term solution to radicalism. You need to have, to begin with, preachers who are in South Kashmir in different mosques. You need to study them. You need to see how, apart from religious prayers that are freely happening there without any rope toke, you need to understand how these preachers are playing a very significant role, because they are godly figures in that particular village or area. And every Friday, they are meeting 100 to 200 youth and telling them that the only way forward is to fight violently. And that's how, unfortunately, Adil Ahmed Dars of the world are coming ahead and becoming suicide bombers. And now, unfortunately, another threat of the sticky bombs that is coming in Kashmir. So let's not, in many ways, some political players also try to suggest that Article 370 abrogation had a lot to do with reduction of terrorism also in the valley. I think these are two very different things, aspects. We need not confuse this at all. Radicalism, unfortunately, is at its peak right now in the Kashmir Valley. It may not be visible. Many of the politician friends in the government may not agree with my assessment, but I think the recruitment and radicalization is at its peak. It doesn't matter if the particular terrorist or a radical does not have a weapon, but he is radicalized, he's brainwashed, and there need to be awareness campaigns, grassroots political activities, etc., that need to be carried forward. And also, in the larger political aspect speaking, the political parties that play a major role, regional and national, in Kashmir, need to be told that your politics needs to change. The politics of hatred, the politics of division, the politics of communalism cannot shape, be it the right wing national political parties or be it the nationalist regional political parties in Kashmir, because they also play a significant role in shaping the mindset of the youth in the village areas. Thank you. Abhinav?
May I step in before Abhinav comes in?
Please, sir.
Because I think there's a need for me to explain one or two things. What Aditya says, absolutely bang on. No one is going to believe you, Aditya. No one is going to believe you. No one is going to believe me when I say whatever I'm going to say. Because how many people among those who have to be believed, who want to have to believe, know anything about the radical aspects of Islam? In the 90s, there was a whole campaign which was run. Like as I said, right under our noses, it was run. How many people knew it was running? It was an invisible campaign run by invisible people. Invisible threats. Why? Simply because our approach to security was the use of the AK-47. Right? Pump in a few bullets and your problem is vanished. That is what everyone believed in. While from the other side was flowing a strategy which had put together the last every piece of it together. And it took General Petraeus in Afghanistan, it took him 10 years for the Americans to realize in Afghanistan that it was not the physical terrain of Afghanistan which was important. It was the cultural terrain of Afghanistan. Similarly, Kashmir's cultural terrain is more important than the physical terrain. And this is where the academics come in again. You see, the academics have got a huge role here. They are the ones who analyze. They are the ones who do research. They are the ones who come to us and explain to us. You have picked up all this through the dint of your own hard work. I've done it through my own experience there. General Dua is from the same regiment and he has commanded the same corps. He belongs to the Jammu and Kashmir Light Infantry. He knows everything about it. How many people are like three of us who know this issue? And it's the ignorance which has been exploited to the hilt, complete. And you are 100% right. The problem of radicalism is at its height today. And no one is realizing it. And don't know how to do it. They don't see the models which are there around the world, which have been very successful. The Singapore model, you see, how well fought this whole thing in conjunction with Malaysia and Indonesia. Singapore has been able to keep terrorism and radicalism away from its shores, although it's got a 15% minority of Muslims in Singapore itself. These are issues which need to be studied very, very deeply intellectually. These conflicts, let me explain at the end, these conflicts are intellectual conflicts. These are not ham-handed AK-47 related conflicts.
Just before we move on, Lyric, can you hear us?
Yeah. So Sean, can I speak?
Yes, I'm back.
Abhinav, if you just give me a moment. Yes, I think we had lost Lyric in the middle. So I would just like to go back to that point and then come back again. Lyric, I think, yeah, you can hear us fine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the question that Aditya and I had put to you was regarding the effectiveness of AI in fighting misinformation, specifically in identifying coordinated networks, non-state actors like QAnon that you brought up earlier, and also maybe state actors, if you may have identified them. So how do you use AI in such a difficult situation of identifying misinformation and identifying networks of misinformation and effectively countering them? As General Hasnain said, this is also an intellectual exercise, and a part of that misinformation also sort of forms the misinformation intellectual crust of information flow in communities. So how would you look at the role of AI in this?
Sure, absolutely. I think I'll take misinformation separately and disinformation separately, because both the methods to detect them and respond to them would have to vary, and they do in a lot of the work that we do. So first of all, we need to understand kind of what a large monitoring scope would be. Kind of what communications are we looking to monitor, open source ideally, across various social media platforms and the hundreds of millions of domains that exist in the world that could pose a threat to our national interest. And that context could be anything from radicalization to known state actors to criminal organizations to known fraudsters, etc. So what is the operating scope and what's the monitoring scope of what we'd like to monitor? The challenge is we can only monitor what's publicly available, or when platforms give us certain access, or various technologies are built to work around various bot blocking and crawl blocking technologies that platform have built. So that's doable. It's challenging, but very doable. Where we hit a bit of a brick wall is when it comes to closed platforms. How do we start monitoring closed platforms? Even there's a low-hanging fruit. It's all of the open access groups that exist on Telegram, for example. So the way, especially in the radicalization context, these groups work is that there's a hierarchy to them. So imagine an inverted pyramid. That's effectively the structure of these layers of groups. So the open access groups tend to be the groups that are the largest, that have the most people in them, but it tends to have the least radical behavior in them. What then happens is as you go down the layers, as whoever the group admins are and the influencers within these groups, key decision makers in these groups are, they decide who goes into the next tier and the next tier and the next tier. So Telegram is kind of a recruitment channel. And the only way sophisticated monitoring can work is via sock puppets and other ways, and having credible sock puppets that can go deeper and deeper into those groups. The other option is to try and propose kind of outlawing encryption, etc. But the challenge with outlawing encryption is you can't kind of block a technology from being proliferated. You can stop major platforms from using it, but there's still going to be another equivalent that's going to turn up, probably from an adversarial country that's going to use the same technology. So what we need to devise a way of doing is learning to live with encryption to an extent, and finding which countermeasures work, what investigation techniques works, what intelligence gathering techniques work, that work with encryption in place without trying to break encryption, because it's as discussed, it's kind of a futile exercise in the long run. So one of the things that we found, particularly around our monitoring work in 2019, was effectively what's needed is a community of whistleblowers. All we need is a community of whistleblowers spread out across each of these regions that we're looking to monitor. These whistleblowers expose us to misinformation, just sharing misinformation or anything that they might be hesitant to. We then share back links with them with kind of all the tracking meta attached to it, so that anyone they share that link with is trackable as well. What we end up then building, while respecting encryption then, is basically a click graph of where this rumor is, in theory, come from, because that's the direction in which the links are going to travel. So that there are ways of respecting encryption and still conducting all this intelligence gathering exercise while respecting the privacy of kind of normal law-abiding citizens. On the challenge of identifying these threats, that's just the monitoring challenge. Now it's the threat detection challenge. Sort of one of the questions I think in the Q&A was what social media tools are being used in Kashmir, etc. And there are a lot of sophisticated tools that are being used, but the challenge is, at the end of the day, large monitoring teams are required, the way things are currently done, to profile this content, to profile activity, and to profile accounts, to figure out which ones are threat. They're either a threat because it's false information, it's coordinated inauthentic behavior, it's an automated account, it's a cyborg account, it's an account affiliated with an extremist group, like multiple. There's hundreds of threat signals that we can consume. But all of that work can be automated. The threat detection to a 90+% degree of efficacy can be automated. And that's kind of in one of the cases where we were working, we identified a large cluster originating in Pakistan that was targeting the Honorable Prime Minister wherever he was going in India, just to spread disinformation and misinformation about him, and kind of ramping up local opposition to the Prime Minister that naturally exists. So one of the most successful techniques that adversaries have learned to use is amplify existing divisions. They didn't have to create narratives if certain narratives and biases already exist in a polarized society. All they have to do is strategically amplify it. You throw a few bots, throw a few academic papers, throw what looks like reliable evidence, and it works. So it's quite easy through a methodology we called patient zero to go back through time, as long as we're monitoring a certain operational scope, to go back in time to figure out who patient zero was, who started a particular rumor, who cited reliable evidence, and then how did it go viral. So any enforcement action that can then be taken could be done on patient zero or other individuals who are key influencers. So all of this technology kind of currently exists. It's all very doable, but what we need to figure out, and it's kind of a dialogue that's going to require a lot of people, is which systems and which teams and which kind of organizations use this, and what safeguards are required when using kind of such powerful technology. I think a lot of work is still to be done to make sure that kind of AI plays its fullest possible role in tackling disinformation and misinformation.
Thank you, Lyric, for that insight. And
I just have to make 2 points. Can I on the question?
Yeah, sure. So I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, so you can make your point on this, and if you can also just touch upon the privacy versus national security issue that Lyric also touched upon.
Okay. So I think the original question which was asked, that which are the apps being used in Kashmir to radicalize, I mean, sir, my answer is that it's all happening right in front of you. Very simple, just go to Google, I mean, on YouTube, just type, songs released by ISPR on Kashmir, okay, or songs released by Turkey on Kashmir, okay. You'll come across number of links, okay, and if you Google TRT World Kashmir, they have n number of videos. There's one video, Kashmir conflict in 5 minutes. It would start with the idea that in 1947, about 150,000 some people from the Muslim community were massacred in 1947. So this is totally unverified false information coming right from the Turkey's state broadcasting arm, that is TRT World. So it's all happening right in front of you. Okay, I mean I mean, I would say this digital radicalization business. There's this very famous blog. It works in Kashmir, I mean, supposedly run by a few Pakistanis, and it is known in Kashmir, very well known, that if your name happens to be on that blog, you will be killed within few days, and it's very much in public. Like this fellow Shujat Bukhari, the famous journalist who was shot dead, his name was there on the blog. And like today, if you need to threat anyone, terrorize anyone, you just have to provide the person's name on that blog, and it will just start working. Coming to the second part, I think we all talked a lot about radicalization. I have written a book on Kashmir's radicalization scenario, radicalization in India and exploration. It was a Vivekananda International Foundation project, and we did most detailed work on that in the South Kashmir during those days of very hot and hardcore militancy. I conducted a survey, meeting the families of the dead militants and actually working out to what percentage of people joined out of the religious motivation. Each and everything is in there, like what Ahle Hadith is doing. Ahle Hadith is the Salafi Wahhabi sect. What is Jamaat Islami doing in Kashmir? And when we're talking about the radicalization in Kashmir, I think Jamaat Islami is a much or a way bigger threat. Ahle Hadith has been reined in to a large extent because they follow the Saudi line, and we have good ties with Saudi, so they prefer to stay away from especially the separatist and the terrorist organizations. But Jamaat-e-Islami still continues to be the real evil, and they have a massive penetration in the administration also. So if you go and check the Facebook post of the people who are working in the administration, you will get a good idea of what their sentiments are, and it's not to be blamed. They do it because the dominant narrative, the larger narrative, is of speaking against India. I mean, because they feel that if you write in support of India or you speak in support of India, you'll be shot dead. And if you write against India, you'll be perfectly fine. So this anti-nationalism is being incentivized in some way. So that factor of that terror, they say that, I mean, if you write against Pakistan, Pakistan will be coming and shooting you. But if you write against India, what will happen? At the max, some agency will be calling you some small short session of questions, and you'll be free to go. So those are the dynamics where we need to work on, and Jamaat-e-Islami is something which we need to really target. That's it. Yeah, privacy versus national security. I mean, in this matter, I can only express my personal belief. I feel that we are placed in a very different situation. The kind of fault lines which we have, the kind of diversity which we have. So certainly we cannot have the definitions of privacy directly superimposed from the Western world. We need to define them given our conditions, given the quality and conduct of our neighbors. Okay? So we have to, just keep those things in mind. Okay, like in the recent Indo-China standoff, there were think tanks openly running programs where they were supporting China's, strategy to deal with this COVID pandemic. Okay, there were newspapers openly running, op-eds and opinion pieces, even the advertisements in the favor of China. Okay, so now, I mean, maybe in the Western perfect democratic world, Switzerland, you can have that, but in India, I really doubt whether you want that or not. So you need strict laws which may lead to the infringement of privacy also, sometimes freedom of expression also, but then it is something which is required because you value, life over liberty. That's it.
Right. And I think we have time for one last question, and I would like to go to General Dua on this. A couple of questions have also asked about how efficient our state cyber cells are, and just to expand that, the efficiency of police and paramilitary forces in dealing with and understanding cyber attacks and cyber threats to infrastructure. Um, so, how do you see that on the ground working, and the inefficiencies in that have been highlighted also, and the need for, as you said, other players in the ecosystem to also sort of come together to sort of fight this persistent threat. So looking at police, paramilitary forces, and institutions of national importance, critical infrastructure institutions, where we see certain inefficiencies in understanding the scale and scope and technicalities of cyber threats. So how would you sort of broadly look at our need on these fronts?
Uh, like you said, the police and other organs of the government which have cyber cells. Now, today, when you report a cyber crime to a police station, there are very few police stations, and I'm not talking of any particular state, across the country. There are very few police stations who are really, really equipped to take action in some meaningful way. Because cyber crime is such a crime that you can go pan India. That means you are not restricted to jurisdiction of your police station. If I report a cyber crime here that I am being threatened by somebody in Coimbatore, this police the station that I report to the cyber crime unit is required to take action there. Now that's not. It's neither very practical, nor do they have the wherewithal. But that's the nature of the beast. This cyber has no frontiers. We've been talking about in different facets that it doesn't have any frontiers. So coming back to the point, it does throw up enormous challenges on one hand. On the other hand, we are not equipped as of today. We as different speakers in different veins have brought out, we have a lot of catching up to do in the field of this the cyber warfare, or the cyber challenges, or the cyber threats. So not only since you asked me a question about police, I said that. So where does the answer lie? Even when I said that the military should take a lead, because I said if it's a threat to the integrity or of the country and the citizenry, then someone has to take a lead in trying to offer protection. So coming back to the point, how do we move forward? I think till we build capabilities in our organizations, whether it is the military, whether it is police, whether intelligence agencies, one large untapped resource that we have is outsourcing it. We have India has been or there are many Indians working all over the world in this field, in software and connected fields. Whereas so we need to outsource this to professionals. There are several professionals available. There is a professional resource that is available. I mean, we have one of them talking in this panel of details that we can't even understand fully. So similarly, there are organizations. So this is a perfect example of where I would, to use it very loosely, public-private partnership, and where we need to dovetail dovetail all the resources we can in a very different way. Hasnan has spoken about it, Aditya has spoken about it, and everyone else is, when we talk of academicians or we talk of dovetailing any resource that we have. So last sentence, in my view, I think we need to take on board this excellent resource that we have, and not shy away from outsourcing small parts of it, taking professional opinion. Even in running the narrative in Kashmir, we've been talking a lot. Today, instead of all other factors, our discussion, which is rightly so, has started focusing on our influence operations, the psychological operations, and in Kashmir more. It is bound to happen. Even there, I think whether it is the army or the military or the state government, we need to outsource a lot of it to professionals, weigh in their opinions, and we cannot continue to do it in a departmental sort of an approach. Thank you.
Right. I think we are out of time. If any of our panelists has one last word, maybe in 30 seconds to maximum a minute to sort of sum up. Or
So just since your question was about cybersecurity, I want to give a personal example, and it won't take more than 30 seconds. Last year in May 2020, amidst the lockdown and the pandemic, I received 2 threats through phone call, not directly. Two senior journalists, one working with Bloomberg and another working with AFP, were called from a US number, but it was later found out that it was internet-based calling that was used. And subsequently, threats were made, and I basically thought that this was just barely propaganda. And it was told that Aditya should be told that there will be consequences if he doesn't mend his ways. And just a formality, I complained to the cybersecurity wing of the Delhi police. And subsequently, I was told that number could not be tracked and investigations are on. And I didn't hear from the police for over 10 months. And last Saturday, this Saturday, in fact, I received a phone call from a senior police officer trying to ask me, what was that complaint all about, and can you give us details, because we could not track down the number. So it took 10 months for them to revert to me and find out, what really had happened. So I think the lackadaisical approach also needs to change at the bureaucratic level, at the functioning level, and timelines need to be set. Yes, we are very much equipped. I have greatest respect for our security forces. That includes Delhi police and their cyber security. But with the changing times, a new dynamism and innovation needs to be brought in. Thank you.
right, and I think with that, it's time to wrap up the discussion. And we've had a very invigorating and engaging discussion, when we've touched upon quite a wide variety of topics today on the issue of visible threat of invisible actors. So thank you very much to our panelists, General Hasnain, General Dua, Abhinav Pandya, Lyric Jain, and Aditya Rajkol. And thank you to the members of the audience who put in questions, and apologies if we haven't been able to sort of pick a question. We've tried to sort of bunch many of them into the discussion we've had today. So thank you once again. And thank you to Logically for organizing and hosting this wonderful session today. So thank you.